the many types of harassment that exist. I only just became aware of the obligation chocolate harassment, but more seriously, there is, of course, the government. And, this is something that Japan's kind of been famous for. I mean, particularly in the 80s or whatever, people talk about, oh, it's so much better now, which isn't to say that it's good. But it's kind of amazing when you think about the open acknowledgement of how casual harassment. I mean, Japan in the 80s and 90s was like Mad Men. But yet the government's only just started taking statistics on this recently, where okay, so this is a non-profit group that's taken a survey basically of people living around Tokyo between 15 and 49, yeah, and as you can see, men and women both experience it, but particularly women. I mean, nearly 50% of women have experienced unwanted touching or close contact. 20%, 1 in 5, responded to a survey saying that they've been physically assaulted. It actually amazes me that physical assault is twice the rate of verbal assault, and indecent exposure, and so that's basically perverts. 1 in 5 women have had that. So yeah, really interesting here. And this is on NHK. This is an NHK feature. Again, you could argue that this is 20 years too late, but again, some people who think that dining together constitutes consent, relatively high, 2/3 think that kissing constitutes consent, but 30% acknowledging that no, consent is consent, and you can't take revealing. I mean, 9% taking revealing. Again, very man-minish. So this is a problem which continues to exist in Japanese society in spite of that. For the first time pretty much since the end of the war, Japanese female employment in Japan has just exceeded 50%. We've sort of reached a milestone that there's now more women participating in the economy, in spite of the economy not necessarily being totally ready for them, but which is good. The participation is increasing, and this is something where Abe has been a big fan of the idea of promoting Japanese people working more, having more babies, getting more women working rather than relying on immigrants per se, although of course they're increasing the number of immigrants as well. But of course the big problem is that as much as they're trying to do things, and indeed Japan has excellent maternity leave, for example. You get paid vacation of 12 months or 18 months. I think 12 is mandatory, and you can apply for extend for 18 months, but which is particularly used in Tokyo because childcare often isn't available after 12 months. So there's aspects by which it's good, but at the same time there's no question that women are often penalized. They're still treated, there's discrimination in terms of they're passed over for career opportunities if it's thought that they can have babies, which is part of the reason why, like in Korea and other countries, women who are seriously interested in working are choosing not to get married because they recognize that it will penalize them. So part of this participation and this increase in participation in the paid economy can be attributed to the fact that women are choosing not to have kids. So it's kind of, the levers are going in these different ways, and of course what the government really wants, I suppose, is a way that people can have the economy can grow and women can participate in the economy and have kids at the same time, and they certainly haven't figured that out, but they have gotten the numbers up this way by basically making adjustments that basically mean that women have to sort of are expected to sacrifice, or not even are expected to. It's a side effect. It's not intended or targeted, but it's basically that the way that the society is that if you want to be taken seriously and have a career in advance, it's often the case that that's not seen as being compatible with having a family, and this is where it's kind of it's difficult. People are expected to work long hours, and that brings me to this article which came out yesterday by Motoko Rich, who is the Tokyo bureau chief of the New York Times. And she did this story basically covering the plight of being a mum and working in Japan. And I've been in roles in my last few jobs where the departments I were in were majority female, and probably of those women, majority of them were certainly mums. Not all of them were mums, but there was a really high proportion, probably more so than not. And yeah, the challenges of that, I must admit, you should read it. It's a well-written article. It does, the intro and the lead-in, it does play a little bit into old-fashioned stereotypes of Japan, particularly this idea that Japan is this 1990s, 1980s bubble, hard-drinking, long working hours, overpressure sort of work society sort of culture. That is still true in places. it certainly is changing. The idea, it certainly now is more acceptable to be able to go home at 6 o'clock. I try to go home as close to 6 as I can, so I can spend some time with my son in the evening. So that concept is certainly changing, and you do see more and more discussion about dads who, probably up until 20 years ago, it was pretty common for dads not to have any engagement with their kids almost through their whole lives, and you would hear about this being a normal part of Japanese society. When I was being introduced to Japanese culture through Japanese language, that's changing. It's not to say that it's universally flipped from one to the other, or that it was ever quite all that bad either. It's really stereotypes. The stereotype is softening, maybe more than this article gives it credit for, but certainly if they find some women who talk about the challenges of meeting the expectations of still an economy where in many industries people are expected to work exceedingly long hours, to spend time going out and drinking and having those sort of relationships that that men bond over, and to be one of the guys basically. And it's really hard to balance that when you have a kid, and there's no question here that when people are working lesser hours, when they're going out, going earlier because they are, and this also does come down to the fact as well. One is the fact that the companies still don't really accommodate the culture of corporate Japan, is still coming to terms with accommodating the idea of women working and having kids at the same time as working. The other half of it is, of course, for working couples that have kids, there's still a default expectation that the mum who is working is also going to take all the care of the kid. Again, as someone in this situation, myself to some extent, it's something that, certainly, in every country you do hear about the idea of, women not getting recognised sufficiently, and it always being a pain point of unrecognised work that somehow women get expected to do by default, and I'm guilty of this. In terms of my son's schooling, there's tons of papers and materials that they talk about in here. This is a real thing that you have to keep up with the homework and stuff like that. And it takes me a long time to go through it, and my wife goes through it. Sometimes when I ask what's that about, she'll get irritated and say, as if you ever show an interest. It gets, the idea that it's that role's been pushed to her. This is something that happens apparently even in Japanese families. But yeah, the idea that the woman's expected to go home, the mother is expected to go home and take primary care of the kid, even if both are working and both have careers. It's not to say that that's universal. There are cases, I know of cases where the woman is the primary, the wife is the primary caregiver, and is the primary salary provider, and the husband looks after the kids. But that still is rare. Frankly, that's rare in New Zealand as well, but it's becoming more common, and it's probably more common than it is in Japan. Certainly the challenges, you can't help but going back to old-fashioned tropes about the old sexist Japanese sort of companies and whatnot, but elements of it, to degrees and extents and in different places certainly. And overall, there's no question, the point being that there's a disproportionate burden that women shoulder at home as well as at the office that still hinders their ability to really participate in the economy, even though their participations are higher than it's ever been.